a little bit about today's discussion. Emilee Gilpin is Managing Director of Canada's National Observer's First Nations Forward series. And we're so happy to hear from her tonight about what's happening in Brazil. And she'll tell you how she happens to be in Brazil working for National Observer. Brazil is now the world's second hotspot after the United States for COVID-19. The country just passed 50,000 deaths this weekend and has over 1 million cases. And you may have read that President Bolsonaro just tested positive for COVID-19 himself. So Emilee, you've been in Brazil for 10 months now. Can you describe what it's like being there right now as the pandemic unfolds?
Absolutely. I just want to do a quick introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm Emilee Gilpin. I like to identify as a Michif nomad. I'm Cree Métis, Filipina, Scottish, and Irish. Born and raised in Canada. And I came to Brazil for the first, not for the first time actually, I had been here before, but I came last August for my sister's wedding. So she, my brother-in-law, her partner is Brazilian. So we've had ties to, you know, these southern territories for quite a while now. She actually lived in Brazil for a year when she was 17. But I came and I never left. I started freelancing. I went to Peru for a couple months where I was practicing my Spanish and building relationships there in Cusco specifically. And then I came back to Brazil and I've been here ever since. And I mean, Brazil is, of course, it's an entirely different cultural reality. It's an entirely different political reality. So for me, what was an interesting experience was Carnival back in February. And Carnival really speaks to the social realities of the country. It's a very social country. Obviously, it's a hotter climate. There's, you know, it's different. There's big families, big groups of people, a lot of social events, a lot of samba and forró and dancing and music. And it's really embedded into the cultural identity of the country. So you can imagine having this global health pandemic take place in a country like Brazil. It has an entirely different impact on, you know, the culture, on the social relationships. But, you know, Brazil quickly started, you know, coming in second place for the most deaths and the most, you know, confirmed cases. And a lot of people have been speculating that both the US and Brazil have reached these high numbers due in part to the leadership in the countries. I mean, Trump and Bolsonaro aren't that dissimilar. They're more alike, I think, in some ways than they are different. And Bolsonaro, he was, you know, famously quoted for calling the COVID crisis a little flu. When it first broke out across the world, he said it was a gripezinha, which is a way of saying it's just a little flu. And he went on to say, you know, some people will get it and some people won't. But, you know, he's been recorded. I watch the daily news now and then, global TV, and they're constantly reporting on him being at public events without a mask, shaking hands with people, just showing what a lot of people have speculated is just a complete disregard for the measures that, you know, World Health Organization have called for, and really caring about people's health and encouraging others to take these quarantine measures seriously, isolation measures seriously, social distancing, wearing a mask, and he hasn't been demonstrating that himself. So, you know, who knows if that's a big part of why.
Emilee, that's so interesting. Thank you. And I've been talking to you since over the last few months since you started working for us again on the First Nations Forward series. And by the way, everybody, Emilee's series is phenomenal, and please check it out. You've been doing these amazing interviews with people, you know, First Nation leaders and visionaries in British Columbia through this whole thing. But what I wanted to, you know, as we've been talking over this time, you kept telling me you're in this amazing remote place and it really hadn't gotten there. You know, like, how are you, Emilee? How is everything? Can you just tell us what's going on with that now in your community, and tell us where you are, tell us what it's like there.
Okay, well, I'm in a national park called Chapada Diamantina. Named Diamantina means diamond, so it's actually named after the diamond mining industry that was really prominent here until the 90s, really. And then mining, from gold and diamond mining, there became a tourism industry that took over. Diamond mining kind of became a thing of the past. So a lot of the tour guides that you see in Chapada Diamantina are the sons or the grandsons or granddaughters of diamond miners. So there's about, you know, 2, 3 or 4 generations of miners here. But now it's this grand national park just full of you know, fresh water, bodies of water, big waterfalls. And in some ways, the municipalities, the cities are spread out. I'm in Lensois, which is probably more of the touristy, at the time, more of a touristy city. Of course, the tourism industry has been completely shut down because it was mostly Europeans that were coming to visit, you know, this grand national park and going these pretty jungle-like hikes and get to know the land. But so the tourist industry has been shut down. The town turned very quickly into a ghost town. There is festivals. The San Juan festival was canceled. The way of life just, you know, changed entirely. Most people went to the Hosa, to their farm, to their land, you know, to start planting again. But really, the local municipal government was doing a good job of keeping people out, and there were no cases up until this week. So this is the first week when now COVID has reached Lensois. There was 1 case reported on Monday, and that quickly turned into 30 cases in 1 day. So, I mean, that's just another example. In 1 day, because this person had symptoms for about 5 days before they, you know, sought medical help. And there's 1 small hospital / clinic here. So again, this isn't the kind of city that can hold a big outbreak. If conditions do get severe, people will have to travel to another city, which is Seabra, which would be about an hour away. Again, not enough facilities there. So the next big city is Salvador, and that's 7 hours away. So Salvador already has a huge amount of cases. So that's where we're at right now.
I really want to hear more about this, Emilee, and I'm sure everybody does. I want to take a moment to let everybody know, in case you don't, that you can go down to the bottom of your box, your Zoom screen, and click on chat and open up the chat room and communicate with the other participants on the call and respond to what Emilee's saying. And you can also open up the Q&A box down there, and you can add your questions. After I talk with Emilee for the first half hour, we're going to turn the discussion over and take questions from you guys. So Emilee, my first question is just like, please tell us more about like, what is that like on the ground in that community with 30 people now have COVID after all this time when nobody had it?
Well, I mean, there's been definitely a shift. You know, I think for you folks, perhaps when you have cases all around, you know, maybe you experience that fear, that the looks that people give you, don't come near me, you might have it, you know, that's just really hit now. People were being very careful over these last months. Everyone has been careful and following the recommendations. And of course, the rest of Brazil has just been hit so hard. So people have been careful, but now that it's here, and it's people you know, and it's in this neighborhood, you know, it's just amped up a little bit. So, you know, people will be staying in home, fiquem em casa, staying home, and that's the way that it's going to be. But I haven't left Lensois since COVID happened. I haven't, you know, left this city, but I've been following the news. Of course, you're in Brazil. I'm following mainstream news and I'm following independent news. And that's why I really tuned into the fact that Indigenous communities in Brazil, and especially concentrated in the Amazon, have been hit so hard by COVID. So, you know, we have over 11,000 confirmed cases in Indigenous communities, over 430 deaths of Indigenous elders, chiefs, knowledge keepers, community members. And it begs the question, why? You know, you have to ask, why? Why is this happening? And what does it mean for Brazil?
See, it begs the question of why. Why is this happening in Brazil? Why I guess that gets back to the president's policies. Today he announced a partial help for Indigenous people, but several measures that were thought to have been really advantageous for Indigenous people and their health were not included in what he threw his support to. So what do you think, how are Indigenous people being affected, and what do you think the future is for them? And is this ultimately about industry?
Mm. Well, I mean, the reason I say that Bolsonaro is more like Trump than not is because, you know, a lot of people have said that Trump has emboldened racism or has emboldened other realities in the US. And the same can be said here. Bolsonaro campaigned on the promise to stop the demarcation of indigenous territories. So demarcation, that's the term that's used here in Brazil, where they go through this whole process with a government body called FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation or the National Indigenous Peoples Foundation, to really say these are traditional territories. And once that recognition is in place, then outsiders have to leave. That grants a whole political reality of self-determination. It's like a toolbox of being able to continue to practice your self-determination. So when you have this limbo where there are some territories that have not been demarcated, and then you have a president come in who has all the, you know, he wants to stop the demarcation process altogether and has really done a good job of doing that. He's taken out people from FUNAI, from that organization responsible for protecting indigenous peoples, especially isolated peoples and people with only recent contact to societies. He's put in people, you know, a new president, he's put in a new coordinator, and the new coordinator that he just recently put in this year was a former missionary, evangelical missionary, spent 10 years trying to evangelical or, you know, transition indigenous peoples into the church. So it's very clear that he, you know, has no, he's actually said in his speeches as well that he wants to integrate indigenous communities and quilombos, people living in quilombos, which are communities of formerly enslaved peoples and their descendants, and he wants to integrate them into society. So he doesn't want to respect indigenous people's diversity and self-determination and self-rights. He wants to integrate them, and he wants to use their land for industrial development. He's made that very clear. He wants to continue to sell off big chunks of the Amazon. And we saw that clearly when the Amazon was on fire for so long, right? The Amazon was on fire for so long, and the scientists in Brazil that were reporting on the deforestation and the unprecedented rates of deforestation were discredited by the Minister of Environment, Ricardo Salles, and Bolsonaro. And he actually fired the president of the organization that was tracking deforestation for speaking out and being concerned. So it's no mystery what his agenda is. And that leaves this whole really scary playing field where there are illegal miners, loggers, farmers, and hunters that are constantly invading indigenous communities and indigenous territories, and they feel emboldened by Bolsonaro and the lack of protection that indigenous peoples have under a Bolsonaro government. And there've been murders, there's been ongoing murders of indigenous leaders who are protecting their territories, and very little investigation into those murders.
And Emilee, how does that make you, as an observer of all this, how is that making you feel?
I mean, it makes me, I think there's a big narrative, I feel like, that's been taking place across the world in this time. And, you know, in my First Nations Forward interview series, where I've been speaking with indigenous knowledge carriers and leaders and politicians, and a lot of people have been echoing this, like, it's time to pay attention. It's time to change the way that we've been doing things. The world sent us into timeout. And are we going to listen? Are we going to keep doing the same thing? The planet has been in a state of crisis. We've been hearing this from scientists all across the world. So why and what are we going to do about it? And I think, you know, one fact that sticks in my head and that has constantly come up is that indigenous peoples occupy 5% of the world's land mass and yet protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. I mean, there are indigenous communities who are protecting the planet that we all depend on. You know, the Amazon affects the weather systems in the whole world. It affects the rain systems in the whole world. We all depend on the health of the environment. And yet it seems to be that there are different forces at play. There are some forces that want to continue to extract and exploit the land for profit. And there are some forces that want to protect the land, protect the future, the well-being of future life on the planet. So it just seems to be this constant, you know, contradiction.
Yeah, push pull between those things. And in terms, how are the what is the pulse like in Brazil in terms of people's read on Bolsonaro's policy towards Indigenous people?
I mean, it's tricky because there is a large population that supports Bolsonaro. That's why he's the president. You know, there are people that actually believe the things that he believes. There has also been a history of, in a lot of ways, misinformation. There's, you know, you could turn on the TV right now and there'll be a novella, which is like a soap opera. Novellas are very popular in the state that I'm in the country at large. But, and there'll be, you know, people running around playing the Indian naked with feathers in their hair. Like it's still, it's just still very blatant. There's still a lot of racism, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of exotification and romanticization of Indigenous peoples when there isn't that education and those relationships. So there are a lot of people that still think of Indigenous peoples as uncivilized, all those really harmful tropes and stereotypes that have been put out in the entertainment industry and in the media. So there are people that do believe, you know, that people should be integrated into society, that agree and support him. It's not to say that everybody's, you know, against Bolsonaro. And then of course there are people that are absolutely appalled by him and his policies. Bahia as a state in the Northeast where I am now is more of a leftist, known as more of a leftist state, whereas Sao Paulo is more of, you know, more conservative. So it really depends on where you are. It's a big country, of course, right? Brazil is a huge country, biggest country in South America. So there is quite a bit of diversity, but yeah, it depends on who you ask.
Yeah. And is there a connection to be made between why far-right anti-Indigenous pro-resource governments like Brazil, America, Russia, Mexico are at the top of the worst death tolls, do you think?
That's a good question, Linda. I mean, I don't want to be biased. I want to, you know, I would have to really do my research. I have my gut intuition, you know, my gut feeling as to, yes, of course there's a connection. But at the same time, I can't say that for certainty. I can't prove that. It'd be interesting to see, you know, a little more research into that. But yeah, I think, you know, I think the crisis has been mishandled here. And I think, you know, it's devastating to see how human rights violations have really been emphasized during this time. I mean, like when we ask about why Indigenous peoples have been hit so hard, a whole conversation arises around social inequities and disparities, around lack of access to healthcare. I mean, talking about that limbo, that political limbo of not being in demarcated territories, people who aren't in marketed territories will not receive the same kind of government support. So like personal protection kits, for example. So there've been a lot of grassroots organizing trying to get personal protection kits to Indigenous peoples who are not, you know, recognized, or who are living in urban spaces and are not recognized as being, you know, worthy or eligible of that support. So it's just creating, you know, it's just really highlighting a lot of social inequities. I mean, Linda, there was a story, it was pretty heartbreaking. In May, there was a tribe, the Yanomami people, there was 3 women who were experiencing different, you know, health conditions. So they had to travel to the nearest hospital and they brought with them their 3 kids. And when they got to the hospital, the 3 kids were, you know, separated from them, contracted COVID, all of them died, and then the bodies were taken. And there was this huge, it's been this huge thing in Brazil over the last months for anyone who's paying attention to these things, because it's not hitting mainstream, but of these women begging for the bodies of their babies so that they could take them back to their community and go through their death rituals and death ceremonies that they need to do for the spirits to pass on in a good way. And I mean, it's just been recently, months later, that those bodies have been, you know, the bodies of children have been dug up and brought back. And that's not the only case where that's happening. So you hear these stories about people, you know, kind of far away from the media's eye of, you know, how is this happening? And so systemic racism is a real thing here as well.
You brought up the issue of drinking water, you know, of health issues. And I was just thinking of Canada and Brazil. You mentioned, or I saw Bolsonaro in his bill, he didn't get behind guaranteeing clean drinking water to Indigenous people, is what I read in The Guardian. I believe I have that right. If anybody wants to correct me on that, that's great. But I'm pretty sure that's what it said. And drinking water is such a huge problem for Indigenous people in Canada as well.
Mhm.
How do you see that? Like, why is this going on? It baffles me that in really
Colonization.
wealthy countries, they're, you know,
Yeah, yeah. I
it's
mean,
just,
well, looking at how these countries, how is Canada wealthy, right? How is Canada wealthy? Where did that wealth come from? We say Canada's wealthy because it's wealthy in resources. Who protected those resources for thousands of years and continue to do so, right? If it weren't for Indigenous peoples from the north to the south and beyond protecting the natural environment, then it would just be monocrops. You know, if it were up to Bolsonaro, all of the Amazon would be, you know, made into agro industry and mining, and it would just be for profit. And so we really can't separate Canada from this conversation either. I mean, even during a health pandemic, there's been man camps have continued to function. There's still been pipeline construction that's been going on. There are still people on the front lines, you know, fighting for their rights, especially when, you know, there's still this political gray area around rights. So this conversation around why are certain people being impacted and others aren't, and why are people fighting for the right to have, you know, access to clean drinking water, it goes back, it becomes political. It's like, well, where are the rights recognized? Because in Brazil, in Canada, we know it's Section 35 of the Constitution. Well, in Brazil, it's Section 231 and 232 of the Constitution. So there's constant violations of, you know, constitutionally protected rights. But before a constitution was made by colonial governments, there are also Indigenous rights, you know, within Indigenous governing systems. There are, you know, internationally recognized rights under the UN, you know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And there are fundamental human rights as well. So we really, you know, we really have to look at why communities have been impoverished, right? As a journalist, you know that I'm very mindful about the language that I use. You'll notice I don't actually write vulnerable communities because I don't want to perpetuate a narrative that some people are just victims. That's just the narrative. A lot of people have been overexploited and impoverished and over-targeted. And so, you know, I like to be accurate, you know, I like to tell the truth. And then with that said, we have to mention the fact that another huge crisis right now is the Navajo Nation. So in Indian country in the US, the Navajo Nation has just reached over 8,000 confirmed cases, 379 deaths, and that's in one nation. So I spoke to, you know, an organizer of Seeding Sovereignty and Indigenous-led movement in the US, and she said to me today, she said, you know, because she was talking about people not following protective measures and going into Indigenous territories, camping, and going into little stores and restaurants and leaving trash around, and this idea that there are people bringing the disease to Indigenous communities and putting people at risk. And she said, Americans are so fucking spoiled and so used to getting what they want. They don't have, you know, that they're not protecting other people's rights. And the same conversation is happening here in Brazil. A lot of people are saying that the reason that a lot of communities have contracted the virus in the first place is because of government workers, or like I mentioned, illegal miners, illegal invaders, or, you know, missionaries. So there's a big, you know, desire to keep invaders out. And that's one of the things that the major Indigenous rights organizations, APIB here in Brazil, has been pushing for, is the right to outsiders to leave and to not let people in. And, you know, with that said, it's been interesting to see that in, you know, BC, a lot of nations have taken that upon themselves, right? I don't know if you saw, but in Haida Gwaii, right, the Haida Nation, they set up their own roadblock to check in on who was coming in and who wasn't, and saying, hey, you're not welcome here, you know, because Indigenous peoples have survived germ warfare. Smallpox blankets are a part of Canada's history, you know. The Yanomami people that I mentioned before, they survived, you know, massive measles that were brought to them from outsiders just in the 1950s. So this isn't the first time that Indigenous peoples have been faced with, you know, a global health pandemic. It's in living memory, it's in genetic memory. And the fact that there are outsiders putting people who, you know, are more at risk into really precarious situations is like a re-traumatizing event.
Emilee, you wrote really beautifully at the beginning of the pandemic about Indigenous people have survived these kinds of things before. And that story I really recommend to everybody on the call. It's been one of the most popular stories of the year. It really struck a chord. So that's one thing I just wanted to draw to people's attention, and also saw that on Haida Gwaii, there was more controversy this week because a fishing lodge tried to open, and I think the nation was saying, no, we don't want this. I didn't follow it that closely, but I'm pretty sure that was going on. So, and I also remember that one of the first infections I think I read in indigenous populations in Brazil came from a doctor who came to visit the community. Is that right?
Yeah, I mentioned that website or that organization APIB. They have a website that hopefully Lori can link, apib.info, and they've been tracking based on their conversations and relationships with community members where these viruses are kind of starting. And there's been a lot of cases where it's believed that it has been medical staff or it's been outsiders that have brought the virus to communities, right? So it's again that conversation around what are people's rights to say no, you're not welcome. Yeah. And it's, it was pretty empowering and inspiring to see the New Hulk Nation, for example, take a really strong stand and say no outsiders, no tourism, no, you cannot come here and, have this ride out this quarantine in our territories. The Healthsick took a similar approach. Different nations did that across BC, and nations are wanting to do that here as well. And some have those rights, like I mentioned before, because they've had recognized demarcated territories. And then others haven't had their rights recognized. So like I said, it's a conversation that constantly goes back to rights.
Yeah. Emilee, can we turn for a moment back to you and your experience there? I just wanted to hear from you a little bit about, you were supposed to be back in British Columbia in May, and what happened? Why? Tell us about how things unfolded for you.
Yeah. One of the first things that happened here in Chapada-Diamantina and Lensoy specifically is public transportation was canceled. So no more buses. And the only way for me to get to Salvador, which is the nearest airport, would be to hire a private car, which would be about 1,200 reais. That's about $400 just to have a car. I mean, so there's just logistics in that sense. And then also it ends up being about a 2 to 3 day trip back. You're going through quite a few airports. Usually there's a stopover in the US. I mean, there probably would be, changes there, but it just became impossible, really, and really dangerous. It's like if I really wanted to go chase after the virus, I would do that. I would travel at that time. And so it didn't feel like
sure that you got COVID.
Yeah. Exactly. So it didn't feel right. Yeah. So I stayed put, and I've stayed put, and like so many people, everyone's been situated in this during this time in different ways. In so many ways, you have to just embrace the uncertainty and do what you can with what you have where you are. So that's just kind of where I've been. Now, don't ask me when am I coming home and what the next steps are, because I'm still just embracing the uncertainty.
Well, I want to really compliment you for how you kind of took things and turned them around. Like, there you are, you're stuck there, and you're doing our First Nations Forward series, which is really situated in British Columbia. And we're all like, how is that going to happen? And you just, went onto Facebook, and you've had these really phenomenal talks with, can you just tell us a little bit about who you talked to and why and how to find them?
Sure. I mean, I think the First Nations Forward series, not to like blow our own horn or anything, but was like way ahead of the game, right? The First Nations Forward series is dedicated to highlighting stories of success and sustainability, Indigenous-led stewardship in BC. And you had that journalistic intuition that was like, there's so many things happening. I feel like we're not really covering it. Maybe we're not doing it in the right way. And then when I started following these stories and building relationships and learning, it's like there are so many stories of success, of clean energy projects, of guardian programs, of tribal parks programs, of really creative ways of exercising sovereignty and working with Canada's government at different levels. So I mean, for me it was like it's been an honor to do this work. And then in the time with a global health pandemic, I mean, you mentioned that article. I wrote 2 articles at the very beginning. One was about it not being the first time Indigenous peoples have experienced, but the first one that really went viral was that COVID is telling the world what Indigenous peoples have been saying for thousands of years,
Right.
which is that we can't do that, what we've been doing. We can't work in the way that we've been working because it's not sustainable for the environment. And so, I mean, that's something that I was hearing from people over the last 2 years working in this project. So I thought, well, I can't really, go back right now, but there's still so many people I genuinely just want to hear from right now because, Joe Martin, from Cleoquit has been telling me similar things for so long. So what does he have to say about it? And then from there, it was like, I've built so many relationships over the last few years. And I've met so many inspiring, humble people with, a lot of knowledge to share. So we all kind of shifted online. And I do have to say, I was inspired by Brazil and the way that a lot of people are very technologically savvy here. Like, it doesn't seem like a lot of people in Canada and the US are really paying attention, but when you're here and you're paying attention to Brazilian, like social media, for example, I mean, there are prominent Indigenous leaders who are holding webinars and Zoom calls and these panels every day. And I was just trying to keep up. I'm trying to interview 2 to 3 people a week, and I'm, seeing how organized they are. So, so I was inspired by where I am and the folks here as well.
Well, your interviews are really touching to me because they do have the quality of old friends getting back together. So a number of them, I recognize some of the people that you interview from your stories, and, they just come alive in these interviews you do with them. And you're an excellent interviewer. So I just, again, encourage everybody, you can find them on the First Nations Forward Facebook page.
Yeah.
So, and we're moving them onto the site as quickly as we can. But Emilee, I think it's quite incredible that you got stuck there, or their life happened so that, you spent a lot more time there. How big is the city that you're in?
There's a population of about 6,000 people. So
Okay.
It's not too big. And I mean, I think it kind of changes with the tourism. Like I said, once tourism shut down, it just, turned into a ghost town. So when I first arrived, I had the fortunate luck of living in a place that I was neighbors just a little bit down the street from these 2 kids. And I just really hit it off with them. And all their cousins kind of adopted me into their group. And so I've been, spending quite a good time with this group of kids. Things are changing now. Again, people are being, more careful than before as well. But it's been great for my Portuguese. Kids are great at teaching you and telling you when you're saying something wrong.
Yeah, they can be kind of merciless about that.
Absolutely.
But they must be, I mean, I can only imagine that in the experiences that I've had in traveling around the world years ago, where, there weren't masses of tourists back then. You would go places and you would kind of be the only outsider there. But that's pretty rare these days. But I'm assuming that that's kind of what it's like for you now.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it anywhere that I go because, I am a visitor, no matter where I go. And so I try and understand what my responsibilities are, how I can be here in a good way. And part of that responsibility is to talk about what's happening here. I am living here and I am, living near water and have access to these lands that people have cared for. So in my, teachings, that requires me to have a responsibility to also, pay attention to what's happening and speak about that as well.
Emilee, we're going to turn now to questions from our audience, from the participants. Before we do, though, I just want to take a moment to tell everybody this is going to be the last in the series of Zoom conversations that we've had since sheltering in place started back in March. And it's been just an experiment. And I think, it's been phenomenal for me to talk to so many amazing people, including Emilee. And I just want to let you guys know that we're going to take a break for the summer, but we're going to be back in the fall with really an incredible lineup of people. We don't have confirmations on everybody yet, but I can just tell you there's some really amazing, good people that we're going to get to talk to and hear from. And so you can stay in touch with us about that by subscribing to the newsletter, becoming a subscriber, or just checking the site. So back now to the questions. So we have a question from Matthew Lyons. Has the situation in the United States influenced the politics in Brazil, or was it simultaneous development based on other forces? Was it a simultaneous development based on other forces?
The situation in the US, meaning in the last months, or is that how you read that question?
We can't really hear back from Matthew, so I read that question as the situation politically. You've already kind of touched on that. The situation politically, the situation, Trump's comments on COVID constantly.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
and Trump, also maybe we're talking about race. Maybe we're talking about Black Lives Matter.
Right. That's what came to mind for me.
Yes. Yes.
I wasn't sure. I mean, in Brazil, so the state of Bahia has the biggest Black population outside of Africa in the entire world. So that's the state of Bahia, right? Because Brazil has a history of slavery. You know, there were more. It's a horrendous history. It's, you know, of the way that Indigenous peoples were first, you know, treated and conquested, and then the history of slavery. But there's a lot of violence against Black bodies in Brazil as well. There's a lot of police brutality as well. There's a documentary series on Netflix called Guerras do Brasil, Wars of Brazil. And in that, it's recorded that a young Black person is killed every 23 minutes in Brazil. So when, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement took it's kind of weird to say this, but took another big breath this year, you know, after the horrible murder of George Floyd, people were empowered in Brazil as well, just like they were across the world. You know, there were big mass solidarity protests across the world, and that certainly sparked protest here as well. But we have to understand it's also a different reality here. Some people will maybe naively say, Brazil doesn't seem very political. It doesn't seem like people are just taking to the streets to protest. And that was kind of something that I, you know, thought. And then you realize it's not quite right. And also it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous to protest. You know, there was a prominent journalist, and Marielle, who was murdered, you know, a couple of years ago as well. Like, it's hard to speak out here. And with that said, I will mention, you know, I talked about FUNAI, right? This organization that's responsible for protecting Indigenous rights. And my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, his sister's husband was actually a coordinator for FUNAI. And so, you know, I've actually had a lot of inside conversations with him, and he is not able to say anything. Like, when I was reporting on the Amazon on fire for National Observer at the beginning, it was really hard to get comment from government and I actually saw with my own eyes emails that went out from government saying, don't talk to journalists. Like, there is a big silencing culture here as well for anyone who works for government. So it's hard. It's hard to express your voice. And yeah.
To follow up on that question, you know, I know there's been a lot of problem with fake news and accusations of fake news in Brazil. Is that a spillover from the US, do you feel, or is that just part of the culture?
Oh, I think that's just, you know, that's just its own thing as well. I mean, it's hard to know, you know, what is reliable and what's not. And that's why you really have to check different sources and pay attention to, you know, what grassroots organizations, independent media are reporting as well.
Okay. So this question is from Tyler. How has COVID-19 impacted illegal mining and forestry happening in Brazil? And how great of an impact are these practices having on the Indigenous people in the Amazon?
Yeah. I mean, like I mentioned before, it's, you know, Bolsonaro really having an anti-Indigenous attitude and stance, and it's empowered people to act on their racism and to take advantage of that as well. So do I have the numbers as to whether or not there's been an influx of invaders? No, but I do know from paying attention and following community voices that there have been ongoing evasions. There have been ongoing murders even during this time. And then there have been people making moves as well to continue to push forward mining and agribusiness. that was happening when the Amazon was on fire, and that's happening during a health pandemic. Like nothing really seems to slow down industry.
Yeah. Except prices of commodities. Emilee, this is a question from Louise Wolf. What is the power of independent media outlets and freelance writers in bringing stories from rural communities to national attention?
It has all the power in the world. I mean, I think it's actually a matter of life and death in a lot of ways. Like if there weren't independent media, and I have a list I can send out as well, but media like APIB that I mentioned, Indigenous leaders like Sonia Guarajara, media outlets like Media India, Media Ninja, if they weren't reporting, in many ways, it wouldn't make it into mainstream media. And you wouldn't be hearing about these women who are begging for the bodies of their babies. You wouldn't be hearing about the Indigenous leaders who are being killed in the forest very far from, you know, cities' eyes and minds. And so you wouldn't be hearing about these stories. So there's really something to be said about the power of community organization and of people bringing these stories forward. I mean, any rights that have been attained have been community pushing for those and fighting for those rights, in, you know, at all levels and politically as well. So independent media plays a fundamental role here and elsewhere.
And what can we do in the West to help the situation abroad? That's a question from Hedia. Those are Hedia.
Right. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, you know, we have to understand there are ongoing issues in Canada, right? So it would be a little bit absurd to be saying that we should be helping, you know, Indigenous communities in Brazil when there are a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada and you know, in the US as well that are fighting for their rights. They're fighting, you know, for access to clean drinking water in some cases. They're fighting for the right to have, you know, healthy lands and lives. That's why many communities are against different industrial projects as well. So, I mean, I think in some ways it's really good to educate ourselves, and it's really good to connect the dots. I mean, it's good that I'm here in many ways, because we can have these cross-cultural and cross-country conversations because we're not separate. You know, there's a lot of similarities in struggles and victories and politics, right? So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And if we stand up for the rights of Indigenous peoples anywhere, we're standing up for the rights of Indigenous peoples everywhere. And we're standing up for the rights of, you know, our futures as well and the future of the planet.
Is there a sufficient counter movement against Bolsonaro's policies, and any hopes of the situation improving there for Indigenous rights and protection and environmental protection?
I hope so. I mean, I don't think that time or progress is linear. I think in many ways we have developed as a species on the planet, but in many ways we've gone backwards. So I don't see it as linear, but I do see mass mobilization. I do see more information available online. You know, there's a big Fora Bolsonaro, Eli Now, you just have to hashtag any of these, and there's tons of people behind it. There's also prominent celebrities and influencers who are constantly, you know, speaking about the contradictions of a Bolsonaro government. So there definitely is movement here. You know, there definitely are politically minded, driven people who are doing what they can to educate and to, you know, protect their rights and hopefully, you know, make change. Just like you see a lot of pushback in the US as well, you know. So that's definitely taking place. It's not by any means a passive people here in the South, so-called South.
This is a question from Ana Carolina Ramos. I am Brazilian and I live in MG. Here we have a lot of indigenous population, and conservative people have a bad preconception of those indigenous. Do you think this has something to do with Bolsonaro's statements about Indigenous?
Absolutely. I think when you have a president, you know, no matter what, we like to kind of laugh at him and some of the ridiculous things that he has said, but at the same time, he's still the president of the country. That still comes with a certain amount of clout and power. And when he's saying things like, these people are civilized people and we need to integrate them, and it's just very dehumanizing things. And, you know, when it's a lot of his stance around Indigenous people have been very infantilizing, you know, very dehumanizing at its core. So I can imagine that a lot of people who maybe don't know any better they hear a government making these kinds of statements and are like, yeah, you know, they feel more emboldened, more empowered, and even confirmed in their own beliefs, right? So that's dangerous.
Janet Love is asking, are you in danger?
I don't know. I mean, we're all in danger in one way or another. I don't think so. I like to think not. You know, I'm pretty smart and I think well protected, but I think at the same time, you know, it's tricky. It's a tricky situation. We have to be really, really careful. I think all of us have to be really careful. To pragmatically, there's not a lot of, like, if something were to happen, you know, there's more barriers to having access to, you know, like the kind of hospital, you know, needs that you need. But no, I don't feel like I'm in danger. Thanks,
Good.
Janet.
And this question is from Louise Wolfe. What would it look like for Indigenous governing systems to be provided with the means to administer their own healthy protective measures in healthcare?
That's really interesting. I mean, I think there are cases where that is happening. I think there are cases in the world where Indigenous peoples, you know, are trying, at least with what they have, to run their own health programs. I mean, like if we're looking at in BC, for example, some of the culture camps, right, that people have been running have been really healthy and healing for especially Indigenous youths reconnecting to their cultures. But it would look very diverse. I mean, that's another thing to really keep in mind, is there are over 300 tribes here. And like in Canada or the US, there's such diversity. People think of Indigenous people as some like homogenous group, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. There are different cosmologies, different, you know, governing systems, different languages, relationships to land, territory. So, I mean, it would look very different, but in some ways, I think it would be in the right to be left alone for people to live their lives, and lives that they have been living, cultures that have existed for thousands of years. So, you know, yeah, that would look different depending on where you are, but it might, you know, might be pretty beautiful.
And what percentage of Indigenous people are not demarcated? Ellen Weber asks us.
Let me see. So I wrote an article that was published yesterday, just kind of letting people know, and I have that stat there. I'll just bring it up here. I think it's 120. Yeah, more than 120 traditional territories claimed by Indigenous groups have not yet received government recognition. So I don't know what the population is, but I do know that it is over 120 groups.
Wow.
It's significant.
That is. Natalia Back asks, do you think that foreign countries could foster policy to hold the private sector, especially transnational companies, accountable for their supply chain, environmental and social impact, can be a mechanism to supply the lack of leadership and rule of law in Brazil?
Yes, and I think there are international laws that should be respected and aren't. I mean, I mentioned the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's been recognized by different governments, but it hasn't actually been implemented in many cases. So if that declaration were implemented, then a lot of these things that we're talking about would not be acceptable, right? Running a big industrial project through a community, or, you know, pushing a community out altogether, would be completely illegal, and is on an international standard, but that always doesn't apply. It doesn't happen on the ground. So yes, I think there should be a, you know, overarching protective measures as well. But at the same time, in practice, we've seen that that's difficult.
Thanks for that, Emily. And a last question from Ted. Is Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept an influence in Brazilian media?
Yes, The Intercept does a great job covering issues here. They have a really good reputation. I've seen some of the work that they've been doing. I mean, The Intercept was really, they had someone on the ground during the Amazon burning for so long, and getting those photos out was really key to, you know, having some of this coverage. The photos, for example, that we've been sharing for this event have been taken by a Brazilian photographer, Bruno Kelly, who's been stationed in Manaus, a city in the Amazon. if we don't see photos of these mass grave sites and of community members embracing each other and, you know, really dealing with things on the ground, as we know, photos make a huge impact because we can hear things all day long and really not feel it. So again, it's not about the numbers, you know, it's about the names, it's about the stories, it's about the people, the relatives. So I think photos make a big difference. And yes, the Intercept have done a great job, in my opinion.
Thanks, Emilee. I heard also, I remember reading, it went by my newsfeed pretty quickly, but Glenn Greenwald was in trouble with the government. They were threatening to arrest him not long ago.
I mean, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me. Yeah, like I said, journalists are at threat of being killed, of being attacked. I mean, that's the reality here. Journalists are killed in many different countries, you know, in South America, in the Philippines, in Mexico.
Yeah.
It's not an easy job to tell the truth when people don't want you to tell the truth.
Right on, right on. Well, Emilee, I've learned a lot from you tonight, as I think we all have, and I've learned a lot over the last 3 months from all of our guests. Once again, it really started as an experiment, and I didn't know, and my team didn't know how it would evolve, but it has. We're going to be back in the fall with some great stuff, and I just wanted to tell everybody that I listen to your feedback. We listen to your feedback. I've gotten lots of input from people over the last 3 months. Some people were like, stop interrupting. And other people were like, push back more. Don't let her keep talking. You know, I've just gotten the gamut. And I just want to tell you that I listen to it and I learn from it. And I always really appreciate hearing from participants on these calls and our readers, and it's your questions and your participation that makes this worth it. So you offered excellent questions tonight, and you have in the past. I'm sorry to anybody whose name I garbled. I'm really sorry about that. I don't get your names ahead of time. I just see them for the first time in the chat. But more than anything, I just wanted to say, we cannot do anything that we do at National Observer without all of you, from our amazing First Nations Forward series that Emilee is directing brilliantly, even from Brazil, to conversations, to all of the investigative reporting you see on the site. So I just want to encourage you. I bet a lot of you on this call already are subscribers. Please share with your friends, ask them to subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at Linda_Solomon. Follow Emilee at Emilee Gilpin. Follow National Observer at NatObs, and be in touch. We want to hear from you. So Emilee, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's such a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you, everybody else. It's been a great series, and I look forward to seeing you in the fall.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thanks, everybody.